When animals kill humans, authorities may take swift action to eliminate the threat. Once an animal has tasted human flesh, they almost always attack again. But sometimes the animal evades authorities trying to hunt him down and lives to kill another day. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we tell the story of 3 killer sharks that are still on the loose. Welcome to Final Affliction. Kimon Bisongo and Diego Malaysi met 13 years ago on a beach in Ibiza. It was love at first sight. Kimon, a South African native, spoke English, and Diego could only speak Spanish. But even though they could barely understand each other, they made it their mission to learn how to communicate. And what better way to do that than over their shared love of cooking? After Kimon returned to South Africa, the two remained in touch, with Kimon learning to speak a serviceable Spanish, and Diego took classes that helped him become fluent in English. Diego was the one to make the big move across the seas, moving to one of South Africa's biggest capital cities, Cape Town. Together, they opened their little corner pizzeria, Fernando's Pizza. In between busy shifts and a rich social life, they carved out the time to run a soup kitchen that served the poverty-stricken communities across the city. And Kimon worked closely with the Rainbow House organization to fight homelessness in Cape Town. To say that the two were loved in the community would be an understatement. Kimon and Diego were loved by the rich, by the poor, and everyone in between. Almost everyone knew them by name, and if there was an event, whether that be charitable or a sporting event, they were almost always counted on the guest list. Together, they had a daughter, Luna, and Kimon, now in her mid-30s, was planning on trying for just one more baby before she reached her 40s. But the COVID-19 pandemic threw a wrench in their future plans. Together, the happy little family braved the storm that hit the world, and once it was safe for business to commence as usual, they hit the ground running. Like everyone else, they had their plates full trying to salvage their business, to reopen their soup kitchens. And now that Luna was starting kindergarten, the school runs and sporting events took up a big chunk of their time too. 2022 was an exhausting year, and the family decided that they'd take a short break in September, just as spring came to southern Africa. The big holiday season would start in December, and with all the preparation that they needed to put in before that time, this would be the last chance that they'd get to catch some of the new warmth that came with spring, and the rush to make up for lost time hit them in full force. Plettenberg Bay was 300 kilometers away, but the 4-hour drive went by quickly enough. The warm weather brought a handful of out-of-season holiday goers and surfers to the resort town. During peak season, the place is packed to the brim, more so than the other coastal hotspots. But in September, it was just full enough to add a little excitement to a weekend away, but not so much that the overcrowded streets and beaches became claustrophobic. The family spent their first afternoon unpacking their luggage at the resort that they booked into, and they took Luna out to play in the shallow pools with her fishing net. After they'd caught a handful of tiny fish and picked up a shiny shell or two for Luna's collection, Diego and Kimon picked up some takeout on their way back to their hotel. Luna was fast asleep by the time they pulled the car in, and Diego carried his daughter to her bed. They decided to let her sleep. She'd like her chicken nuggets just as much for breakfast in the morning. Saturday dawned even brighter than the day before, and all of them were itching to get back to the beach. Diego offered to stay behind so that Luna could finish her nuggets and have that bath that she missed out on the night before. So Kimon headed off to the beach, along with the other early risers at the resort, planning on meeting them there later. The resort's beach was just a 10-minute walk from their chalet, and Kimon didn't even bother to take her phone or any belongings besides her towel with her. She and Diego fully expected to see each other again within the hour. September in the area also brings its fair share of juvenile sea lions that have been weaned from their mothers and are finally old enough to venture out into the water on their own. Inevitably, this influx of the inexperienced prey also brings in the predators. Just 3 months ago, there had been a fatal attack on a human from a great white right on the stretch of beach where Kimon was swimming. The warning signs and red flags were long gone from the sands now, and the country had all but forgotten about the tragic event. Besides attacks being incredibly rare, the oceans also have nets spun around popular swimming destinations to keep the bigger fish out, and a slew of observation vessels that are constantly scanning the surface for sightings. How the 14-foot great white managed to slip through the nets and the searchers' sharp eyes is still a mystery. It literally came out of nowhere. Kimon was amongst 20 or so other swimmers, and there were 4 surfers in the distance riding the rather low waves. There were at least 10 people who were deeper in the water than she was. Kimon was only standing waist deep in, watching the riders attempt to catch a decent wave. The only explanation is that the shark came from as deep as the water allowed it to go, and it applied the usual tactic when storming into a colony of sea lions. Great whites hurl themselves into the middle of the pack and bite down on the one who just happens to be closest to its jaws at the time. Whatever the case, one moment Kimon was standing with her back to the sand, with Diego and Luna walking towards her, and the next, an enormous gray beast reared out of the water directly in front of her. Its mouth was already open and geared to strike before it even broke the surface. Kimon didn't stand a chance. There was no warning, no time to even think of turning to flee. The predator sank its teeth into her, engulfing Kimon's upper body whole. Only her head and legs remained outside its jaw. Diego, who'd had his eyes on Kimon when it happened, grabbed Luna and stuffed her face into his chest to spare her the gruesome sight that was playing out before them. The group around Kimon scattered, knocking each other out of the way to reach their children and to make it out to safety. The shark took Kimon like she weighed nothing, viciously throwing her from side to side. One older gentleman launched himself at the screaming woman. What he planned to do about the dire situation, no one knows, but it didn't matter. The shark's head slammed into him, sending him flying several feet away. His equally gray-haired wife grabbed him and pulled him out. As the water turned red and the people fled, several people called emergency services, and Diego could only stand watching as the love of his life was being ripped to shreds. Before the last of the hysterical swimmers were even out of the water, Kimon stopped screaming, but that didn't stop the animal from tearing at her. It let go, swimming off with a chunk torn out of her abdomen. After making a wide loop, just long enough to swallow, it struck Kimon's lifeless body again, this time making away with a piece of her left thigh. Diego couldn't take it anymore. He shoved Luna into the arms of the elderly woman who'd helped her husband out of harm's way. Diego was about to enter the water himself. It didn't matter that she was already dead, or that he stood a good chance of dying himself if he dared to go in, as long as he could get her out. The old man saw what he was about to do, and despite his bruised ribs and his age, he grabbed Diego and held him back, yelling at him that his little girl shouldn't be orphaned completely. Diego didn't hear a word of it, and he continued to struggle to get out of the surprisingly strong old man's grasp. The other swimmers came in, huddling around Diego. They kept him from going into the surf towards certain death, and that's where rescuers found them just 7 minutes after the attack occurred, with Diego weeping in the center and the ravaged body of Kimon floating in the shallows. The shark had disappeared, satisfied with what it could get from Kimon, and it was never seen again. The poorest streets of Cape Town went into a deep mourning. The homeless and the impoverished went on a spree to steal flowers from homeowners' gardens in the more affluent parts of the city. And now, even 2 years later, Diego and Luna still find a bouquet of flowers most days of the week when they go in to open the store for the day, a constant reminder of Kimon and the day she met her terrifying final affliction. It was November 13th, 2004. The harbor at Cock Bay in Fishhook, Cape Town, South Africa was noisy and busy with the influx of people readying for the day ahead. It was still early in the morning, just before the sun had fully risen, but the fishermen were already out and about. They knew that the reduced daylight provided the perfect cover for a good catch. After all, fish tend to seek shadows and hiding places, feeding in the peace and quiet of the early morning. As the men chattered away at the harbor, they secured their gear and equipment by the boats, ensuring they had everything necessary. Cock Bay Harbor was a few kilometers away from Fishhook Beach, a white sand beach popular amongst surfers, kayakers, and tourists. A tight-knit community, as the seaside village was mostly home to local retirees and families. It is undeniably one of the most popular places in Cape Town. When everything was ready, the fishermen began their journey a few kilometers from Cock Bay Harbor toward False Bay, where fish were waiting for them. A sliver of daylight illuminated a portion of the sky, giving it a reddish, early morning glow. The fishermen were just in time. Reaching the designated fishing spot, the fishermen turned off their engines so as not to spook the incoming school of fish they had carefully prepared for. The weather was great. The fresh southeast winds blowing over the calm currents of False Bay carried with it the salty scent of the sea. The fishermen readied their nets for casting as the fish scrambled in groups, swimming across the ocean a few meters underneath the boat. In complete synchronicity, they threw the nets and let them sink toward the school of passing fish. Moments later, they pulled it toward the surface to reveal their catch. One glance at their nets, and they knew something was not right. Among their catch was a bunch of fish called white steenbras. These powerful, hard-fighting fish can kick up a lot of commotion. If a group is somehow caught in a net, they can make the water look like it is boiling from how aggressive they shake. Steenbras were also protected fish, so the fishermen knew they had to release them immediately. However, the vibrations caused by the fish were enough to catch the attention of one of the most feared fish in the sea. A great white shark suddenly emerged from the depths, exposing its formidable head to the surface, looking for the injured animal causing the commotion in the water. As the fishermen saw the shark, they released the steenbras back into the sea. The shark was curious but quickly turned uninterested. It roamed around the area for a few minutes and then eventually swam away, parallel to Fishhook Beach. Realizing that the shark was heading toward the popular beach where various people were swimming, the fishermen immediately took action after releasing the steenbras. They headed straight toward Fishhook Beach and began waving a red flag. This was to let the people swimming on the beach know that they spotted a shark around the area. Immediately, the people got out of the water and there was no incident. The next day, on November 14th, Fishhook Beach prohibited people from entering the water. However, throughout the day, no sharks were spotted in the area, so the authorities decided to open the beach for swimming again the next day. This would prove to be a fatal decision. November 15th, 2004. Although it was a Monday, a workday, many people roamed Fishhook Beach, taking advantage of the clear, cloudless morning. The somewhat chilly winds blew strongly from the south. However, it was weak enough that smaller waves with foamy crests did not appear at False Bay. The waters were unusually warm and calm today and lacked their usual swell. It was 7 a.m. and Tyna Webb was at the beach, dipping her toes in the sand. She was preparing for another swim at False Bay. Although she was fully aware of the warnings from the previous day, Tyna was not bothered at all. To her, this was simply another day among her frequent visitations to the beach. After all, she had been swimming here 6 days a week for 17 years. It was inevitable that Tyna would end up frequenting this place. Since moving to Cape Town with her husband in 1987, they fell in love with the place and made it a habit to visit the beach during their free time. However, when Tyna's husband died, she had been living alone in an apartment at Sunny Cove, a place 5 minutes away from Fishhook. Tyna would visit the beach alone in the mornings and go for a swim a couple of hundred meters away from shore toward the deeper parts of False Bay. Although her friends warned her not to stray too far into the ocean, Tyna was a bit stubborn and would never listen to them. After all, she was an incredibly strong swimmer who had a lot of experience. Unfortunately, today was different, and no amount of experience could have saved Tyna from what was to come. Arriving at the beach, Tyna walked across Jagger Walk, a famous coastal footpath following a curve of granite boulders and rock. This is an actual image of Tyna taken by a photographer who happened to be at the beach on that same fateful day. After meandering for a bit, Tyna was ready to swim. She entered the water and quickly began making her way into the deeper parts of False Bay. Tyna found the ocean disarming. Even though she had seen every stone and corner of Fishhook Beach in the past 17 years, Tyna never grew tired of the place. Visiting the beach and dipping her toes in the sand became a normal part of her everyday life. Tyna swam through the waters and eventually stopped at a spot approximately 60 meters off Jagger Walk. She did one of her favorite maneuvers, the backstroke, and continued moving toward the deeper waters of False Bay. Unwittingly, she was heading toward her demise. The same giant great white shark that was spotted a few days ago appeared near the end of Cock Bay. Sensing the presence of Tyna, it swam toward her, attracted by the splashing from her backstrokes. The massive creature cocked its head from side to side, sizing up the 77-year-old from under her. Unfortunately, Tyna hadn't the slightest idea of the predator underneath her. She was too busy admiring the birds flying through the morning sky. In one swift motion, half of the shark's body emerged from the waters. The creature lazily opened its massive jaws and clamped down on Tyna with its rows of razor-sharp 6-inch teeth. The poor woman was defenseless against such a powerful predator as it squeezed her torso into its mouth. The deep blue color of the water turned red as Tyna was slowly suffocating by the pressure of the shark around her body. It shook her left and right as if it were barely even trying, until finally Tyna broke loose from the shark after a chunk of her ripped away into the shark's mouth. The shark thrashed around while chewing on the piece of meat from Tyna's body before swallowing it whole and returning for more. Tyna, who was bobbing in the water in pain and barely hanging on to consciousness, struggled to remain afloat. The creature swam swiftly toward her once again and clamped onto her body. There was nothing she could do. With Tyna between its jaws, the great white shark took her under the water and swam into the depths of the ocean, where she likely would have drowned before the shark could finish her off. The water eventually went calm, and amidst the dissipating cloud of blood was Tyna's red bathing cap, floating on the surface where Tyna had moments prior been peacefully swimming. Many people saw the incident happening. After all, about 30 to 40 people were swimming at Fishhook Beach that morning. However, the attack occurred so quickly, nobody had time to react. Before anyone could do anything, Tyna was already gone. Tim Atkins, in a car high on the mountainside, was one of the witnesses to the attack. I suddenly saw a shark coming at great speed from the Cock Bay end of the beach towards where the woman was swimming, he said. The shark hardly slowed down. It just hit her, and the water was full of blood. It made 2 turns, grabbed her in her side, and pulled her under the water. The shark then turned and headed out to sea. I think it had the woman in its jaws. 2 National Sea Rescue Institute rescue craft were summoned to search for Tyna. Additionally, a helicopter was dispatched to the scene. During this search, the helicopter pilot spotted a massive great white shark swimming near Fishhook. He noted that it was larger than the helicopter and the biggest great white shark he has ever seen. Authorities speculated that the shark was around 6 to 7 meters in length. Like most apex predators, the great white shark typically uses its bite as a way to test potential prey. In most shark attacks from great white sharks, the victim usually sustains injuries from a single bite, as humans aren't typically on the shark's menu. However, in Tyna's case, the shark returned for Tyna after its initial bite, leading authorities to believe she was targeted as prey and she would most likely never be found. Eventually, the search for Tyna was called off by the afternoon, and the beaches were closed once again. Just like authorities predicted, Tyna's body was never found, and all that was left was her bathing cap, which washed up on shore, identified by her son-in-law in the subsequent investigations. Undoubtedly, the shark attack on Tyna Webb was tragic. However, shark expert Dr. Leonard Campagno, director of the Shark Research Institute at the Iziko South African Museum, surmised the event logically. An attack is always a possibility, unless you don't go into the water. This was a risk Tyna had taken every day in these waters for 17 years, which tragically resulted in her final affliction. Geoffrey had been introduced to the ocean at a young age. Since before he could walk, his parents would take him on boats, and from then he always had a deep affinity for the ocean and a deep respect for all things in it. When he was growing up, his passions were surfing, diving, and sailing, but he wasn't sure how he could make a living from any of those. Then, Matrix Ocean Adventures were hiring crew for their new catamaran, and Geoffrey jumped at the opportunity. He applied to work on board the luxury vessel and was accepted as a first mate. His dream of turning his passions into a living had come true. Very quickly, he was informed that the skipper had pulled out of the job and was asked if he would like to step up into that role. Geoffrey was delighted. Although he was brimming with pride, Geoffrey was very modest about his new job and took to it all in his stride. Matrix Ocean Adventures had just launched their new vessel, Matrix, a 24-meter catamaran that slept up to 12 passengers in 6 private cabins. It was one of the most luxurious sailing vessels chartering Australia's western coastline. Geoffrey and his crewmates were excited to be skippering the vessel on its maiden voyage. The adventure began in the south in Western Australia's capital, Perth. From there, they sailed northwards towards the tourist town of Broome. It was a cruise that would take 13 days and nights. Along the way, they moored up in small bays and inlets, swimming from the boat and snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters. It was the trip of a lifetime for Geoffrey's customers, and he knew the best places to visit to take full advantage of the trip. When they were only a third of the way into the voyage and just off the coast of Geraldton, Geoffrey and his crew meandered the boat through the Abrolhos Islands. They headed to the southeast corner of Pelsiart Island and dropped the anchor at Wreck Point. It was around 2 p.m. They had all finished up lunch and were ready for some swimming. The chain of islands offers fantastic snorkeling and diving experiences. The coral reefs host a plethora of marine flora and fauna. The brightly colored fish, playful sea lions, and, of course, sharks are all regular sightings. As the anchor splashed into the water and its heavy metal chain fed out into the depths, Geoffrey and the passengers prepared for some snorkeling. Masks and snorkels were handed out amongst the tourists, and once they were in the warm waters, Geoffrey and his colleagues joined them. He lowered his face into the water. They were swimming near a drop-off, where the shallow reef gave way to deep, dark, blue open ocean. The drop-off was a hive of activity, with parrotfish, wrasses, groupers, and sea turtles picking at the coral reef. The muffled sound of the underwater world added to the tranquility of the experience. But in an instant, that all changed. With no time to react and no warning, Geoffrey was suddenly struck by an enormous shark. Eyewitnesses estimate it to be about 6 meters long. Those above the surface of the water could just make out the dark shadow as it torpedoed directly for Geoffrey. There was no time to shout out, no time to warn him. The shark had appeared from the depths and was on him in seconds. One friend of Geoffrey's was Rod Plug. They both snorkeled near each other, not far from the boat. As they pointed out fish and dived underwater for closer looks, Rod's mask began to leak. He felt the water trickling in, tickling his cheeks as it made its way into the mask and began filling up. Rod took the mask off and wiped his face. He looked at Geoffrey. He was going to tell him he was going to sort his mask out, but Geoffrey's face was under the surface. Instead, Rod began to swim back to the boat. That was the last time he ever saw his friend. As he made his way towards the catamaran, he heard a splash and looked around. With its huge jaws opened wide and eyes rolled backwards, the enormous shark crunched down on Geoffrey. The sheer power from the hit and force from the bite severed Geoffrey's body in two. He was dead within seconds. The other snorkelers in the group saw the commotion in the water. When they lifted their faces above the surface, they were met with a sea of red. A bubbling, boiling of the water as the shark thrashed its head from side to side, biting Geoffrey in two. Horrified, they swam desperately for the boat. As fast as they could, they splashed through the water, their adrenaline surging and not daring to look back. Frantically, they reached the ladder and clambered out. Breathless and in shock, they watched as the shark submerged with half of Geoffrey's body in its mouth. There was nothing they could do. The crew made sure everyone else was accounted for. No one else was injured in the attack. Shaken and tearful, the passengers were terrified by what they had just witnessed. They weren't able to identify the species, but said that from above the water they could see that it was very dark on top and white on its underbelly. They said that it was massive, very long and very wide. They estimated the dorsal fin to be about 1 meter high. Experts suspect the shark was either a great white or a tiger shark. One of the crew members radioed the authorities to report the devastating incident. Then, whilst the passengers were watching the water and the other half of Geoffrey's body bobbing up and down, one of the passengers screamed. The shark quietly re-emerged less than 10 minutes later. Only its snout and eyes protruded from the water's surface. This time it did not thrash around. It did not take a bite from the remains. Instead, it opened its huge jaws once more and grabbed hold of Geoffrey's body. Then, almost silently, it submerged once more, taking the rest of Geoffrey with it. There was a swirl in the water, and Geoffrey was gone. His death had been shockingly quick. Experts cautioned the estimates of the shark's great size, as water often distorts the size of things, but they admit that it must have been a huge shark to have bitten Geoffrey in half in one bite. The distressed passengers and crew decided to head straight to shore following the incident. They motored the boat directly into Geraldton and were taken in by emergency services and interviewed by police. Fisheries Officer Rory Macaulay from the Western Australia Fisheries Department assisted police and emergency responders in searching for the shark. If they found it, they planned to kill it and use it for the forensic investigation. They also hoped to find any remains of Geoffrey for the coroner's report. The search was started almost immediately. However, policeman Sergeant Graham Clifford said that after hours of circling the area, nothing was found. The search was called off as the currents were strong and would have carried anything far into the open ocean. From what witnesses said, there sadly wasn't anything left of Geoffrey to find. No traces of the shark or Geoffrey were ever found. Officers alerted locals in the area to be aware of the dangers. There were rock lobster fishermen on the islands at the time of the attack who were notified of the tragedy, as well as other tourists visiting the area. Rory Macaulay, who worked as a shark research scientist, was asked to comment on the terrible attack and provide some insights into the behavior of the shark. He said there had been nothing to attract the shark to the snorkelers in the water. There was no food in the water and no fishing being carried out nearby. The edge of the continental shelf provides prey for sharks right on the fringes of their deep water habitat, but seeing great white sharks in the area was rare. They are known to swim up and down the western coast of Australia, but it is unusual for snorkelers to see them amongst the coral reefs. Geoffrey's father said that he and the family had received countless phone calls, letters, and cards of condolences in the days and weeks that followed the attack. His son was an incredibly popular young man whose carefree persona helped him to make friends with people from all walks of life. Although it may seem like shark attacks in Australian waters are common, they are, in fact, quite rare. There have been just over 1,000 attacks, with 236 of them being fatal since records began in the late 1700s. Even so, swimmers, snorkelers, and surfers know the risks every time they enter the water. This is shark habitat, and they are simply doing what comes naturally to them. Unfortunately for Geoffrey Brazier, what came naturally for the sharks that day resulted in his terrifying final affliction.